Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on biennials and postcoloniality. My name is Iftikhar Dadi. I'm the moderator of this session, and today we are scheduled to have three speakers, which is Hanru, Thembinkosi Goniwe, and Margarita Gonzalez, Lorente. It is looking like Margarita is having connection issues from connecting from Cuba, so she may not be able to join us live, unfortunately, but she sent a text that I will read. So just some housekeeping before we begin. So I'll introduce the speakers in more detail as when they begin their sessions. The speakers may please mute their microphones when they're not speaking. There is an Arabic interpretation, and the audience can select their language in the box on the right side of the screen. The audience can share their questions and comments via the online eventive chat function throughout the session. And the final 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. We have a lot of ground to cover, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and we'll prioritize those that are the most relevant to this discussion. The audience is viewing this talk via the eventive platform. So please make sure to type in your comments and questions as suggested. I also wanted to thank, above all, Pur Al-Qasimi, Salah Hassan, and all the members of the Sharjah Art Foundation team for putting this very stimulating series of talks and discussions in the March meetings of 2021. Okay, so let me begin now by introducing our speakers, which is. Let we have a very good, we have three important speakers here who are joining us. First, let me introduce Thembinkosi Goniwe, who is an art historian, curator, and writer whose work explores contemporary African visual arts. His curatorial projects reflects post-colonial and decolonial criticism in the context of Black radical thought and global South. He has curated many exhibitions in South Africa and edited a number of publications, including Resilient Visionary Poetic Expressions of David Colonne, 2019, Mary Sibande, The Purple Shall Govern from 2014, and Space Currencies in Contemporary African Art from 2012. Goniwe is currently Assistant Professor in Art History and Visual Cultures at Rhodes University in South Africa. He holds an MFA from the University of Cape Town and an MA and PhD from History of Art from Cornell University. He currently lives and works in South Africa. Margarita Gonzalez Laurente is curator of international contemporary art at the National Museum of Fine Arts in Havana. Previously, she was the deputy director of the Wilfredo Lam Contemporary Art Center and has served as curator of the Havana Biennial between 2005 and 2019. She curated several other exhibitions, including Tres Mirandes in 2007 and it was involved in Cuban Masters in 2004. Among her many publications is the 13th Biennial of Havana, An Experience of Life, and numerous other important publications. She's been honored with numerous awards, including recognition of Metropolitan Radio in 2020. Laurente holds a bachelor's in art history from the University of Havana and a master's in art history also from the University of Havana. She completed her doctoral courses from the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. She currently lives and works in Havana, Cuba. And our third speaker today is Hanru. who is currently artistic director of MAXXI, the National Museum of 21st Century Arts in Rome. Hanru has curated and co-curated more than 100 exhibitions worldwide, including Growing Indifference, 7th Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism and Architecture in Shenzhen in Hong Kong, 2017 and 2018. The Open Museum, Open City exhibition at MAXXI in 2014, the 5th Auckland Triennial in 2013, the 10th Istanbul Biennial in 2007, and the Shanghai Biennial in the year 2000. And he has numerous publications to his credit, including Paradigm Shift, Walter and McBean Galleries exhibitions and public programs at the San Francisco Art Institute. And he is a very regular contributor to magazines and journals, and an advisor to numerous cultural foundations and institutions. Hanru holds a bachelor's and master's degree from the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. He currently lives and works between Rome, Paris, and San Francisco. Now, before I wanted to say a few words about the theme of today's meeting before we turn to the speakers and for their presentations. The question that we are faced with in addressing in this session is the relation between biennials and postcoloniality. The history of the art biennial and its international proliferation in recent years has, of course, been a subject of much study. Broader developments in recent decades in which many cities in the global south have commenced biennial programs is a notable development. Speaking for the South Asia region and the West Asia region, you have, for example, the Kochi Muziris Biennial in India, founded in 2012, the Sharjah Biennial inaugurated 1993, the Colombo Art Biennial in Sri Lanka in 2009, and the Dhaka Art Summit, which started in 2012. An insightful way to understand these developments is to conceive them in a longer history of biennials of the South. Their predecessors are the second wave exhibition platforms that had developed in the decolonizing era in the second half of the 20th century. These were primarily state-led and sought to develop relations across the southern regions that would not require the mediation of the Western world in the The Havana Biennial is the most significant in regard. Its third edition was held in 1989, which is understood in hindsight as a fateful and consequential year, for it marks the fall of communism as well as the globalization of contemporary art. Three pivotal exhibitions denote the latter year: Magicians de la Terre at the Pompidou Center in Paris, The Other Story, Afro-Asian Artists in Post-War Britain at the Hayward Gallery in London, and the third Havana Biennial in Cuba. So all of these in the year 1989. From the 1990s onwards, with the fall of communism and the consolidation of financialized globalization across almost the entire world, the biennial proliferates globally, becoming imbued with new values. No longer state-led or based on country representation, the platform negotiates overlapping and competing agendas. It remains tied to core support from city governments, as well as state and regional entities, but also relies heavily on corporate patronage, including by local and transnational firms. The third wave biennial has diverse objectives, some at cross purposes with others. It aims variously to promote a cool and sophisticated image of the city and the nation, foster creative industries, quote unquote, support local curatorial and artistic practice through patronage exchange with the international art world, and gender new publics for contemporary art, and serve as a site where critical, even antagonistic issues can surface and be debated. Even though each biennial is informed by its previous iteration, nevertheless, each manifestation every time is more or less a completely new exhibition. Thus, the fraught negotiation between competing agendas can be reworked and are thus always open to crisis and possibility. These are the structural constraints and openings from the contemporary biennial of the South. Nevertheless, each site and moment also offers multiple trajectories, and it's important thus to be cognizant of the terrain and move towards values of plurality, democracy, inclusion, and criticality. Now, much ink has been spilled on the critique of the contemporary biennial form, that it's dangerously dependent on international NGO funding, ignores and undermines quieter and longer local initiatives, reifies spectacular art as collectible trophy, panders to the international celebrity art world, and fuels corporatist consumption of culture as hip tourism and lifestyle accessory, rather than its value in promoting critical thinking and practice. The audiences for a biennial are always in progress, are and in crisis simultaneously. Is the biennial intended for local artists, the wider local public, much of which may not be habituated to looking at contemporary art, the international celebrity art world, the beneficiaries of finance capitalism, the leaders and bureaucrats of national and city governments, all of them perhaps. Indeed, one must constantly be vigilant to remain relevant to local issues as much as possible. As Geeta Kapoor has noted with respect to the Kochi Muziris Biennial, and I quote, "We should keep to a scale that allows us to perceive specific pressures and pitfalls to find solutions at the ground level. Consider how the gestalt of the biennial is configured in given cultural contexts, examine their calibrated agendas, their handling of issues such as sustainable funding, relationships with the city, venues, with artists, and with publics. We will find critical framework with a diversity of commitments," end quote. Now, I want to turn to Okwi Envazor's interventions in the topic of our discussion today. During the late 90s, when academic art history as well as the museum world were both just beginning to come to grips with understanding modern and contemporary art as a multifaceted global development, this is also the time when Envazor begins his career. His curatorial projects had immense significance. His exhibitions were instantly recognizable by their ambitious range and depth. And the accompanying publications played an extremely vital role in disseminating his curatorial vision and the work of emerging scholars and fellow travelers within the biennial world, the academy, and beyond. His major biennial exhibitions include the second Johannesburg Biennial, Documenta 11, the International Biennial International Vela in Seville, the 7th Guangzhou Biennial in South Korea, and the Venice Biennial in 2015. These exhibitions were, apart from the second Johannesburg Biennial of 1997, what is notable, I think, about Envazor's projects is that these were actually not the third wave biennials of the Global South. These were actually the older established European and Eurocentric platforms that Envazor reformulated to account for postcoloniality. So I think his practice shows us another way in which the relationship between the biennials and postcoloniality has been negotiated through his career. The other thing that I want to mention about his, there are two other points I want to mention about his practice. One is that not only did he engage with the art world as a biennial curator, he also created many very significant exhibitions that were not biennial based. And the other relationship that he maintains throughout his career is a relationship that is open to the relays between modernism and contemporary art. So while other curators were also beginning to grapple with art as a global practice, many of them focus almost solely on contemporary artists. By now, this has fully congealed into this term called global contemporary art, which is, in some ways, it can be criticized as a dubious and flattened conception of contemporaneity that is presumed to have flourished only in the wake of 1989. However, Envazor's diverse curatorial projects not only address contemporary art from across the world, but also excavated the deeper lineages of modern art and decolonization since the early and middle decades of the 20th century. And in this respect, I think his non-biennial projects remain very, very significant, right? So of the many incisive exhibitions that Envisor curated, an impactful one for me was the short century independence and liberation movements in Africa, which I saw in MoMA PS1 in 2002. The show and its accompanying publications vividly exemplified the tremendous creative and institutional energies unleashed by decolonization in Africa. The exhibition was strikingly multifaceted, encompassing art, publications, architecture, as well as political and institutional developments. No one who visited that exhibition should ever again misconstrue Africa's deep relation to its engagement with modernity and modernism. And I think remains an exemplary show for also for other regions of the global South. Lastly, I may mention his major exhibition in 2017 at the Haus der Kunst in Munich called Post-War, Art Between the Pacific and the Atlantic, in which he returned to many of the insights of the short century and restaged them on a fully global level, now completely dissolving hierarchical distinctions between the West and the non-West. Characteristically, Envisor prepared the ground for this exhibition by convening a 4-day conference in 2014. And in this entire project, we encountered a generous landscape, both familiar and new, but which was above all premised on a recognition that modern art everywhere had advanced through complex global relays of exchange and movement. Post-war has posed a mighty intellectual and institutional challenge to museums and, I would argue, the biennial form that has long claimed to represent kind of art, but which are only now awkwardly begin to address global trajectories that include modernity. I urge all of us, therefore, to think about the relation between biennial and postcoloniality, not only in a very contemporary, with contemporary art, but also examining its extended relationship much further back in time. So with that, let me now hand over the podium to Thembi, who will begin sharing his thoughts.
Thank you, Iftikhar, and also thanks to the Institute, Sharjah Art Foundation for inviting me. And this is a great honor. Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure whether my audio is okay, if you can hear me. Yeah, my intervention, it's more of a proposition. So upon the invitation and also reading the brief we were given concerning postcoloniality and biennales, I've sought to pose a proposition which reads in this way. Is it possible to think of biennale that is socialist and communalist? I'll explain those words, as I'm going along. I'm raising these issues precisely because in the context in which some of us are working, which is the third world or the developing world, there's a question of infrastructure, which is really a major issue. So how do we think of biennale as models and ways in which they can begin to build infrastructure? By infrastructure, I mean a number of things. Let me just name 3. One is to assist in developing institutions that will host, the kind of mega exhibition which we desire in the scale of the biennale, but also to build facilities that will enable the possibilities of what we might call quality exhibitions that enable artists to produce works at the level at which they are, to stretch their abilities to experiment further. So how can we think of biennale beyond what seems to have dominated it as far as the question of aesthetics, the question of representation, issues of identities, politics of mobility, and so forth, right? Those are all important issues that we've learned when we study or we attend, we look at work, that the biennale enables. That would be one of the issues I would like to ask us to think about. Because what seems to have become a trend, in fact, a tradition, is that Biennale has become, you know, an event that international artists always gather, they meet. And some of the artists, they look forward to not only be part of the global dialogues, but also to reconnect with friends, with old buddies, so much that there's an element of partying, right? And of course, in those moments of exchanges, the idea and the question of globalization advances, both at the level of the personal, you know, at the level of intimacy, but also at the level of the social, the cultural, the political, and so forth. You know what I mean? And what Biennale have done greatly over the years is to make these local spaces that are host to biennales, the cities and their neighboring districts or regions in those countries, to be part of a global setup, to bring artists from different parts of the world, to interrupt what has become a routine of a social life in those places, at the very same time, to bring interventions that also ask the locals to think differently about their own, you know, normalized life. But at the same time, the artists who travel into these spaces, including the thinkers who are part of the biennales, you know, as contributors in the discourses, in the panel discussions, and so forth, also intervene in those discussions. But at the same time, they don't only give, but also they take, because there's this exchange of learning in these new spaces. So what becomes interesting then is that now the notion of the global or the globalization of the world becomes real throughout these exhibitions. Not simply by the virtue of the works, the different works that have been imported from different parts of the world, but also the works that are also enacted or produced from those original sites. You know, I mean, where, for example, artists will be traveling to put installations. Some will work with local, you know, organizations, or will work with local subjects and so forth. That becomes interesting. So now the Biennale, what helps, it facilitates and it extends this idea of globalization. You know what I mean? And then it creates more personal relation, human relation, cultural relation. And then what we get now is this intensification of the cultural capital. That is all good and well. But what seems to be of concern for me is when these events take place in countries where there's not infrastructure, there's no facilities or resources in a comparable sense we find in the first world. You know, I'm not only talking about money here, I'm talking about resources as far, you know, with regard to human skills. Let's take, for example, you know, the Dakar Biennale in Senegal, which every year it counts. There's a constant review comment about artists struggling to find, you know, ease with transporting their work, you know, the custom, the late arrival of works, you know what I mean? And also the personnel just to hang these exhibitions, the venues that are not equipped enough, some of them are deteriorating and all of that. But the beauty of it is that artists, as always, instead of complaining and sitting in a corner, they will improvise, they will work with this side, they will turn the space, they will make art become part of improving the situation. And that it makes it really exciting. But at the same time, what that leaves is this constant, this repetition without difference. So what I'm saying is, how then we begin to ask, what will it mean to curate biennales that are also invested with building infrastructure? Infrastructures that are not only buildings, infrastructures that are also helping and developing humans that will be prepared so that the next biennale, the next event, is not going to reproduce the same problems that we encountered before, right? This is what I'm asking. That could not be a responsibility of artists. I think that responsibility will rest mainly with the curators, because it is them who design, who propose what the biennale should be or become. And also it is curators who identify and invite artists around the world to make interventions. intervention in the forms of exhibition, in the form of performance art. They also invite intellectuals, creative, and many others to converse, and interact. So what I'm asking, how do we stretch that beyond, again, another set of party whereby the familiar faces, the reconnection of friends, artists who haven't seen each other, it ends like that, and then people pack and leave, and then they leave the place with no infrastructure left behind. So is it possible then to design biennales that are invested with this idea of social and communalist projects? So by this I mean, what will it mean, for example, to look at already existing centers, organization, personnel, activities within these cities that host these biennales? And then to ask, for example, artists from different parts of the world to think of projects that are not going to be only exhibition displays, to think of panel discussion and all those intellectual activities that are not only going to be another talk show, but they'll be also orientated towards developing the infrastructure. So that by the end of that biennale, which is usually and is always a temporary event, it leaves an infrastructure, whether that infrastructure is an initiative to begin with or inaugurate a possibility of infrastructure. So when the next biennale comes, it's either it builds on that infrastructure, it advances that infrastructure, so that over years, we will stop complaining about the lack of facilities. We'll stop complaining about not having, good installers of exhibitions, because biennales themselves now they become a way in which we build the cities, we build infrastructure. That's one point of us to ask what the biennale should be doing in the context of the post-colonial. And of course, this is not only a responsibility of curators, it's a very burdening responsibility. But it is also a responsibility that curators can be able to also subject the politicians, to subject the kind of players within the cities that are host of these biennales. So they begin to work with the organization, to work with the governmental structures, so that art is no longer simply a symbolic way in which it collapses the difference between art and life, but it becomes the actual life itself. It becomes the social, construction itself. It becomes a form of building social facilities. So how do we think of that? I don't have a solution. I'm saying this also mindful, not to turn art and artists into instrumental, into ideological kind of apparatuses. But I also do think that what now we have learned and also have achieved, artists no longer need to be demonstrating their abilities in creating aesthetics, in dealing with issues of representation. Artists have excelled into that. Even younger artists, they pick up quickly. The kind of installation, the use of technologies, the experimentation with mediums, the way in which artists are working, they're beyond thinking. So what I'm interested in, how do we stretch that imagination by creating conditions that create possibilities to build the infrastructure? So in other words, how do we stretch the idea of the biennale as a temporary infrastructure, as a temporary event, to ask what the biennale can be, to be a very long-lasting echo, but an echo that also builds an intersection of both the symbolic, the fictional, as well as the material, the tangible, right? That would be one thing. But also I'm thinking of, again, projects that might also be looking at social and cultural practices. A project that begin to look at the ethics of what it means to be alive today, but also to live for the tomorrow, because we are living in the present while we are building the tomorrow. In what way can we create biennales that create conditions to begin to advance certain practices, certain ethics of what it means to become a modern subject, a contemporary subject? So that art itself becomes a ritual that intervenes that becomes also a way of life, of the everyday, instead of that which is always looked at, is always appreciated, is consumed. But also it becomes both tangible as well as ephemeral. So is it possible to curate and think of biennales of that sort? Because the beauty about biennales is that they are large scale and they come once in a while, and there's an opportunity to design them, to plan them, to build them. So it's a process. Biennale are not like simply you put things, you pack and leave. What do we do with that process? Here we are already talking about temporality, about time. So how do we exploit time as a form of build up these infrastructures? I'm thinking that would be one. A second point I would like to make. I'm making these points thinking again of the problematics that are always there when it comes to the third world. I'm focusing here in the post-colonial. Also mindful of the fact that even in the first world, there's a need to shift what biennales have become a tradition. So this idea is applicable globally. And also the third world and the first world, developing and underdeveloped world, are no longer, binary opposition or sitting side by side. We are already in communication. We are already exchanging. And that's the beauty of this mobility that is facilitated by globalization, by capitalism, and other systems which Iftikhar was talking about, the question of modernity, right? So artists are always moving, and that's the beauty of Biennale, because we move, we learn different spaces, at the same time we intervene in those different spaces. We come into contact with strange cultures while we are bringing also foreign expectations and difference. So in other words, these ideas are not only limited to think about the third world. So they are applicable in other places, So in the first world. Two last points I would also like to make in my presentation is also how do we begin to think about Biennale now at the human level, especially with the question of hostility when it comes to question of migrations. Because we've seen this thing, it's a global issue. And for us here in South Africa, it has become a sad issue. The kind of events that we've been experiencing, for example, of other African nationals who've been like butchered, who've been killed publicly, who've been receiving this hostility by locals. I'm talking about the kind of people have called it xenophobic, some have called it Afrophobic, that we've experienced in South Africa. And of course, these kind of problems are happening in other parts of the world. You go in France, for example, we've seen at some point how, for example, the Muslim were treated, right? What it means to be different, what it means to be a different culture, to a different religion in those setups. And we've seen this also in the US, in particular with the time of the Trump, the building of the wall to prevent the Southern Americans to be moving to America back and forth. Whereas the first world subjects, they always move freely to travel the world. So in other words, how do we think of Biennale as sites and infrastructure, as projects of building hospitality to move toward, what one will call it, an ethic of hospitality, an ethic of accommodation, an ethic of thinking, changing perceptions, not only of politicians only, but also of the everyday, the local people, because most of this violence, as structurally institutionalized as they are, but they have been internalized by local people, especially those who find themselves as natives of those sites whereby these hostilities are taking place. So in other words, when these biennales are designed, are curated, are processed, are acted, how do we begin to factor this ethic of cosmopolitan hospitality? The care not only of the selves, but the care of others. How do you begin to think biennales as a site? And how do you begin also curatorially, intellectually, and otherwise to encourage artists to think of projects that begin to force these local perceptions, these institutionalized ways of thinking about each other as different, right? So that would be like my other point I'm asking. And this is more important in the post-colonial context, right? Because what you find there is not only the distant from the developed world, but also is this strong sense of one we call nativists, and this sense of a claim of a nativity and a sense of being an indigenous, so much that it doesn't open up to difference, especially other cultures that are coming in those spaces, right? So I'm interested now, when these biennials are taking place, how do you begin to take the question of migration seriously, not only as a theme, but also to think of practices, of modes in which we can begin to shift perceptions, but also to develop ethics. And I believe art and artists do have that capacity, that ability to create a project that can begin to do so. And I think curators, they have the agency to set up those conditions for the possibilities of these kind of ideas and practices, right? The last point I would like to also propose is to build on what Okwi has left for us as a legacy, given that he was also to curate the next Sharjah Biennial. You know, one of the things Okwi have done is not only to open up the Biennale as a form of a global space, as a form of a universal site, you know, this mega exhibition. Because what he did, especially with the Venice Biennale, of course, a project that built on what he's done even with Documenta, because what he's done with Documenta, he moved it as a mobile project from Latin America to Africa to India. By the time we arrive in Kassel in Germany, you know, the world is already involved. So he made the Biennale process of these different platforms, so that it was not only an event that is cooked and planned and staged, but it was an event subjected in the process of becoming. But interestingly, what he did with Venice, you know, I mean, it's when he introduced the idea of this capital, the reading of Karl Marx's project. This is why I was saying my interest in this provocative title. Can we think of Biennale as a quest towards a socialist and communalist orientation, right? Because what Marx, what for me, Okwi did, even at the theoretical level or intellectual level, it was to ask what happened to these socialist ideas? What happened to the communalist ideas? I'm not talking about communism yet in the sense of the Eastern Bloc. Even if we slide into that zone, you know, it becomes important because part of what have happened lately, especially as Iftikhar was saying, the end of the Cold War, as well as and the victory of the Reagan and Thatcher regimes, they've allowed the neoliberal capitalist project to take over the markets, and art has been co-opted to a greater extent, even if there are resistance. But to a greater extent, you find artists so driven by market that even ideas are always already subjected to commodification. And the commercial galleries are doing that very well. And one of the things Biennale does, it provides that site for resistance, for delay, for protracting this force of the market, for artists to be given an opportunity to think. That's why the commission of artists to produce new work, to experiment with ideas, with material, with media. That's what Biennale does very well. Hence, I do believe that we need to hold steady fast on the idea of why we need Biennale, even in an event whereby they are struggling. Because currently, they seem to be the sites that provide possibility of experimentation compared to museum exhibition, that they are so safe because everyone doesn't want to disturb the gods, right? Which is the market that drives this project. So in other words, what Okwi did for me was to think of what it is that perhaps at the end of the Cold War, at the collapse of the communist project, the socialist project, what it is that perhaps we should ask as an afterlife of those projects, and what it is the Biennale should perhaps piggyback on to think that we need to rethink them, to reimagine them, and find new ways. Because I do think, you know, I mean, as limited, as questionable as those ideas are, because one of the things Karl Marx and all the Marxists in different stripes, in different grades, they have provided is a sustained critique of capitalism. And I do think these biennales also should begin to think what will be an afterlife of that project in this current moment, especially in the 21st century, that is already maturing, to ask us if we were to think of socialist kind of project, of communalist kind of project, what they should be doing, right? I don't want to instruct here. I don't want to tell what curators, artists to be doing, but I do think it is important to begin to also subject artists to kind of ideas that they seem to be simmering down. They seem to be undermined in the victory that some are celebrating of a democracy that is neoliberal, but we also know is driven to a greater extent by capitalism. And we are learning this for some of us in South Africa, that the way in which the market, in the way in which the economy is driving almost everything that is social life, is cultural life. And then what now we are left with is the bullying. Politicians are bullying us. And the COVID moment has demonstrated that the lives of social subjects have been reduced into instrumental apparatuses. What they do is the politicians are speaking on behalf, but also they are instructing the way we should be and become. Right? So the civilians, I'm wrapping Iftikhar, the civilians are no longer having an opportunity to be driving the body politics. And COVID have allowed that in the rhetoric of trying to do for society. And then politicians, in collaboration with capitalists and other agencies, they've used this moment to control not only the state, but the society. So what I'm asking then, as we are moving through, and then as we're trying to overcome this monster called COVID, so what could be a biennale in the aftermath of it? Or if we are going to wrestle with whether it's a biennale online, it's a virtual biennale, even when we resume the biennale on the ground, what could be a biennale that is socialist driven, that is communist driven? So it is those ideas, you know, if we have to think of anything that is post-colonial, you know, thank you.
Thank you, Thembe. You've raised a lot of key questions and kind of overarching kind of, you know, issues that, you know, we are facing in the contemporary era that we can return to. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to present, and then we can open a discussion amongst ourselves and also with the audience. Okay, so the next speaker was going to be Margarita Gonzalez Lorente. Okay, so I think she may be able to send a video of her presentation. So may I ask who Hanru to go next?
Okay, Iftikhar, thank you. So nice to see you, and sorry for being so late. Actually, I just get on board a few minutes later than because of the time, the post-colonial time. Basically, it's because we are in the time that, you know, we're in the post-COVID time, or during COVID time. That time becomes something else. Actually, we are constantly on kind of fluidity of zooming, then we actually basically don't tell the difference between 1 hour and another. I think this has to do with probably you know, the topic today. It's about, you know, how to deal with this actually the so-called post-colonial legacy or heritage or context that has been created in a kind of general collapse of borderlines, of geopolitical kind of categories, and we found ourselves in a really a kind of on the one hand fluid, on the other hand chaotic kind of deconstruction of established orders in history. And today we are, of course, we are actually getting into a even more complex kind of situation that the colonial has not finished, I would say, and that the post-colonial has somehow becoming a mainstream discourses, but some people even said to say goodbye to post-colonial as one of the triennials, Guangzhou Triangles announced in 2008, right? And then the neo-colonial is also our reality in the name of globalization, and so the so-called post-colonial becomes a struggle to resist to this neo-colonial. So we are having a really overlapping of different way of describing the historical process of transformation, and all this suddenly have been somehow suspended by this COVID crisis that we found ourselves 1 year later than the schedule planned. Instead of being on the side in Sharjah, getting together as Thembi just said that it's a great party to gather friends together, and instead of that we gather ourselves online and so on and so forth. So we found ourselves in a very interesting kind of conflictual complexity that collapsed all the taken for granted categorization of things, right? And in this context, to bring up the question of Biennale, I think it's also a very interesting question. I think there's one thing that I want to really emphasize following, Thembi's how to say, a proposal, then I would actually, by chance, by accident, whatever, I actually prepared a kind of PowerPoint that somehow present some attempts from my personal experiences to answer the questions how Biennale is not only a way to do a fantastic, beautiful exhibition, gathering famous or unfamous artists together, and to continue with the game of the art community and so on, but really open it up to, on the one hand, to embrace cultural diversity, on the other hand, really to help to build infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, especially in places where cultural infrastructures were not built, were not so well established. And I also would emphasize that the so-called post-colonial context gave us a very important kind of responsibility to continue to be defending cultural openness. And it's only by defending this cultural openness that we can help the world to become more open, more diverse, more tolerant towards difference. And the Biennale has a very important role in not realizing this politically, but really making a proposal, visions, how one can, through the artistic language, through the interactions between the creative people and the general public, that one can imagine not only to build a different forms of infrastructure, not only infrastructure, but also really different forms of infrastructures that is relevant to the context, to the place where the Biennale takes place. On the other hand, also this is a process of helping this place to reinvent and redefine its own locality in this so-called, globalization time. So on the other hand, we come back to this notion of the global, right? And each place, well, somehow it's in the process of making itself to be more global. On the other hand, it invents its own locality by this, interaction. So some years ago, I wrote, actually now 20 years ago, not some years ago, it's already a long time ago, that I wrote a text about the Biennale, how Biennale actually can be a way to explore how to reinvent locality. And that is published in several books and so on, but that's fine. But now I think I want to present a PowerPoint that in which I would perhaps, trying to explain that through certain steps of different cases that Biennales can help us to think about some projects from embracing cultural diversity, engaging with the local community, to inventing local but international global infrastructures. So I would go to share this. Here it is. I would like to, start with this project called Hong Kong, etc. in Johannesburg Biennale in 1997. That actually, I guess, Thembi has been, a part of the story. Of course, this is a homage to Oakville, and that was actually Oakville's first major international Biennale, and it's also my maybe one of the first major Biennale projects for me to be working on. So in 1997, in early 1997, actually, I met with Oakville in Paris, and he was working on the Johannesburg Biennale, and he asked me, to join his team to propose a project. So I proposed a project called Hong Kong, etc. And that was the year, of course, the main topic of the Johannesburg Biennale that curated by Oakville, directed by Oakville, with, actually 5 different other sections, other curators doing several exhibitions. And it's called the trade route. It's really about the beginning of, a kind of discussion on globalization of, not only economy, but also really the whole transformation of the international relationship through trading, through geopolitical negotiation, and so on. And of course, that's a very timely intervention into the larger discussion about, the post-colonial. And then in this case, I proposed to work on this project called the Hong Kong, etc. Basically, that was the year also, very interesting, after 1989, the year, well, I think you guys have been mentioning as one of the critical year of this transformation. Then we arrived from the Cold War to the post-colonial kind of engagement, right? And that another very significant year, I guess, is 1997. That that was the beginning of the beginning of the new invention of a global structure, and with very important examples like in South Africa, the major change of the post-apartheid transformation. Then people are encouraged to imagine a new political and social project based on the idea of the rainbow nation. And that is extremely beautiful as a embracement of this cultural diversity, and especially this possibility of hybridization of cultural identities that leads to a much better future, that different people can coexist, different social classes can coexist. Somehow, it's a kind of utopian, I would say, socialist project, if not communism, right? And that was also a moment that on the other side of the world, Hong Kong was being handed over to China after almost 150 years of colonial rule of the British. Hong Kong was returning to China, and that raises a very interesting question for me: is how much this opportunity can help us to think about a new way of a non-Western society can invent itself, not following the same trajectory of the established order of nation states. How actually a city in the time of globalization can actually become a very particular kind of laboratory of a social project that can allow the coexistence of different cultures, different nations, different ideas of life, and especially a kind of cosmopolitan structure that can help us to reinvent perhaps a new post-colonial way of development. And of course, that is a kind of idealist vision. On the other hand, in reality, the negotiation between different political powers in the world didn't go that way. And so how much Hong Kong can provide a interesting example of this negotiation within these very contradictory visions of. And today, actually, we are coming back after almost 25 years, coming back to discussion again in a much more tragedy kind of situation. But anyway, so for Johannesburg Biennial, I proposed to work on this project, and not only having artists like Huang Yongping, Gonzalez, or Chen Zhen, and so on, to propose the visions of how a new kind of non-Western but cosmopolitan visions of cities can be imagined, and then also I tried to bring this project into a kind of unconventional spaces to get in touch with the society in a much more direct way. So unfortunately, I don't have many images because I have all these old style slides, but they're not scanned. So I cannot show it now, but I only could pick up a few images I have on digital file. And with a work of Huang Yongping's Doomsday, Gonzalez African City installation, Chen Zhen's online project, and so on. And on this, basically, for this project, it was physically quite a small project in a theater gallery, the Rembrandt Gallery, in next to the electric workshop, and a part of the African History Museum as well. And then in the meantime, I actually expanded this project into the townships all around the city. Well, the intention is to bring this discussion about the future of a kind of post-colonial world to bring it into a context that, people have never had a chance to get into touch with so-called mainstream contemporary art. But instead of that, we tried to reach out to really bring this discussion, this possibility of exchange with the local people living in the townships. So I actually asked artists to provide me about 50 different kind of videotapes. At the time, we have the VHS tapes. I don't know if you remember this stuff. It's a and then I actually did the research in the townships and find out that in all the townships, people are poor, but in the meantime, there always a television somewhere, especially in the public gathering places like restaurants, bars, or social centers and so on. Well, people spend their time watching sports on the TV, drinking wine, or drinking beer, whatever. So I decided to ask the artist to provide me actually about 25 artists, I don't quite remember the exact number, from all around the world to send me videotapes of their works, very much related to urban changes, to show them in these social gathering places like restaurants, bars, and so on on the television. And then there's a menu on the table in the bars or in the restaurants. People can actually pick up from the menus the tapes that they want to watch, the works they want to watch. So this actually has been circulating in 8 townships. And that was the first step of contacting, really getting into contact with the people living in the township, because the Biennale actually was somehow, very much in the city center. And most of the people, especially young people, they don't have the means even travel to the city. So that was a very interesting attempt to try to reach out to really to present contemporary art and the discussions with to this part of the city, this part of the periphery areas. On the other hand, there's a really interesting story. Is actually in one of the bars in the Alexandria. Well, I met a bar run by a guy whose name is Yang, Uncle Yang. It's a Black person with white hair. He at his late 60s, 70s, early 70s or something like that. He's the owner of the bar. So I talked to him, arrived there, and he came to me and said, "Are you Chinese? And do you speak Cantonese?" And then it happened that I'm Cantonese. So I speak Cantonese. I said, "Yes, I do speak Cantonese." And then he starts speaking Cantonese to me. And then I was so surprised. So he explained me that when he was a kid, he was actually adopted by a Cantonese family in this township. They moved from Canton, from Hong Kong, to live there. And so he grew up with this family and inherited their business. Actually, this is the bar that created 100 years ago or 70 years ago in this place. And then he became the owner of this bar after his adopted parents passed away. So that was such an incredible discovery for me. And also it tells a story that, our, effort to try to engage with the local community through the biennales always, can reveal some really very interesting, very deep, unexpected historical events, stories that brings us to a re-understanding of this post-colonial circulation of people, idea, ways of living, languages, and so on. And that actually it's a very, very important element for us to understand, the necessity to work on this biennale is not only to really presented the best artworks, but also to present the best possible way to reconstruct our memory and rewrite history of humanity in a way. So that's one thing that I learned a lot from this experience. And on the other hand, I also created a website. Maybe that was the first website for Biennale, in which artistic projects and also intellectual discussions took place. And that website actually had invited, people like Isozaki, Ram Koolhaas, Saskia Sassen, and so on, to discuss the urban reality of Hong Kong, and also some scholars from Hong Kong, as a post-colonial site of understanding how, historical and reality present situation have been built. On the other hand, also there's a utopian dimension that, how can we envision a future transformation? And then there's also a open section, very early open section, that people can actually intervene online to make their comments. And that was the first, let's say, incarnation of blogs, for example. And so this is also something to reach out into the so-called unconventional space, in which, when we talk about the commune, this is at the time, 25 years ago, it was like a kind of, futurist commune. But today, of course, it's so normal, right? But so the Biennale allows you to have these possibilities to go beyond the conventional way of not only the infrastructure structure, but also the way of the mode of operation, right? And you can operate beyond all the constraints of, not to say Y cube kind of art spaces, but also, the whole idea of how the relation between artistic creation and real life can connect on the ground, and also in the space, let's say, out into the immaterial virtual world, right? So that this is, for me, a very important moment to understand what the Biennale can do. And after that, this experience has influenced me. I think a lot of curators of our generation, together with Oakley, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and many other friends, to really to develop kind of projects that can help us to go beyond the traditional infrastructure or the conventional infrastructure, to really to try to transform from within the establishment. On the other hand, to invent something in places where the establishment doesn't exist. So, for example, Cities on the Move is one of these projects that traveled, bringing artists, architects, and so on, active in Asian cities, not only Asians, but also artists and creators from architects from the West, from America, from Europe, from different parts of the world, who are operating in Asia, to generate a kind of particular Asian context of urban visions, and bringing this back to the West, traveling through, from Vienna to London to New York to Helsinki to Bordeaux and so on. During 3 years, this project actually, from within, transforming the structure of museums. And then this actually helps us also to think about how to engage people through occasions of like biennales, to make them into participants of the creation of the Biennale, not only as an audience. Even the exhibitions are very open to all kinds of audience. I think it's very important to bring people in it as active actors. So this is an experiment I did for the Nuit Blanche, the White Night event in Paris in 2004. I was one of the directors of these events in 2004. We were working in 100-something sites in the city. And this is one of the projects in which I invited the public to send in their own video works. And then we make a selection. At the end, we presented more than 200 videos in the urban space to celebrate somehow, the experience of, exploring the nightlife in the city. In the meantime, it's very important this, ordinary people find their own work to be seen in the public space. And then related to this also, another very important engagement was, the first major public forum proposed by Thomas Hishon on Foucault. During 24 hours, we occupied the center of the Palais de Tokyo, in which Thomas Hishon set up a large installation, like a public forum. He invited 24 specialists on Foucault to talk about, critical thinking, social revolution, transformation, and so on, as a kind of occupy gesture to take over the Palais de Tokyo for 24 hours. And then this actually helped me to develop other projects with, the cinema, with the public participation with their own work. So this is one of the projects in Luxembourg. In 2007, I was curating one of the major public art projects for the European capital of culture. And this is a cinema in which it's a special design by these three artists from the Netherlands. It's called the Sunset Cinema. Actually, we work with the local community who has their own cine club with, inhabitants who present their own cinema works, their own films. And then I extended this idea of participation of the public into the Istanbul Biennial 2007, in which we work with 5 local curators to invite the participation of the inhabitants, to invite them to contribute with hundreds of short films. And what is interesting is we identified about 140 sites across the city, from the center to really suburbs, very, very far away suburbs, in which we have rented a truck. The truck was bringing a projector to travel to these different spots. Every night it goes to a different place. And so at the end, we end up having, during the 3 months of the Biennale, we end up having 140 something sites across the city in which, these films were projected and the local people can actually watch them. And then other, collaborations with local people have been developed. For example, this is the Lyon Biennale in 2009, in which the Indonesian artist Eko Nugroho has been working with the local young kids to create a theater piece in which they tell their family stories as immigrants and so on. And then this is in Auckland Triennial 2013. Peter Robinson, a Maori origin artist, created an event to bring this Maori, sticks from the center, the National Gallery, the Auckland Art Gallery, to the historical museum, in which there's a huge collection of Maori objects and so on. So in this process, it's like a procession of celebration of the Maori culture from the contemporary world to the historical context. And then this is the Shenzhen Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism, and in which the Italian artist Marinella Senatore collaborated with the local inhabitants to make them into dancers, to really create a incredible moment for the opening, like every, a lot of inhabitants then can participate in the collective dancing, a dance and a procession to actually to be a part of their all, not only a celebration, but also kind of self recreation, a self reinvention through the experience of dancing together. Oops. And then I would very quickly go to also the question of infrastructure. In 2002, I was co-curating the Guangzhou Biennial in Korea, in which with my co-curator Charles Escher, we decided to turn the major part of the Biennale into a kind of presentation series of independent organizations, because that was in the time to somehow as a response to the question of infrastructure in the post-colonial world. In the so-called post-colonial world, a lot of countries has never had a very established kind of cultural infrastructure, not to say contemporary art museum, modern art museum, and so on. And then there was also a moment in the around 2000. These countries are becoming more and more developed and economically strong, and they also have cultural and political ambitions to build cultural infrastructure. So a lot of people were thinking, like in Asia, to build new museums, and these museums very often are modeled on MoMA, Pompidou, or Tate, and that kind of international, Western style museums. But on the other hand, after some research, I recognized actually the most active, most original way of doing things in this context. It's not artists who are showing those white cube institutions, and also the most interesting infrastructure are not the white cubes. Anyway, they're not many of these white cubes anyway. So what is important is really to encourage the most interesting part of these activities, which always happen in the street, in the city directly, in the real life context, and very often as small organizations with a kind of improvisational infrastructure. Very often it's a kind of private house, and there's a kind of temporary structures and so on. And then across Asia, we discovered there are many active artist-run spaces in these forms. So we decided to invite, instead of encouraging people to work to develop projects to become a new MoMA, instead of that, we decided to really to focus our resource to support the independent initiatives with a lot of temporary structures, improvisational kind of mode of operation. So we offered to about 30 organizations from Asia, from Europe, from Latin America to install or recreate their spaces in the Biennale. So we actually gave out the spaces to the organizations, and they reconstruct with very simple materials their buildings into the building of the Biennale, in which we gave out also the curatorial decision on what they can be showing in it, in these infrastructures. So basically, a major part of this Guangzhou Biennale was actually a city gathering about 30 different artist-run spaces. And that also, it's a gesture to raise the question about, what kind of infrastructure that one can imagine and build in the context like the non-Western cities. and how much this can be not only as a solution, a practical solution, but also a proposal for a future diversity of the cultural landscape. So that's another, and we carry on to this idea of inviting independent organizations in different other events. This is the Guangzhou Triangle 2005, and this is in also influencing us how to operate in the West itself. So this is a project in Biennale de Lyon 2009 that I curated, in which I invited a group of so-called illegal immigrations who have a union based in Paris to occupying a place to allow about a few hundred people to live together. So we invited this group of people to participate in the Biennale, to present their work, their also their claims to be legalized. And this is very much thanks to a young lady, this girl, whose name is called Laura Gantz, who actually did the drawings on the daily life of this group of immigrants. And then she sold these drawings in postcards on the street and gathered the money to support the canteen of this community. So through her, we invited this group of so-called sans-papiers, the people who have no documents, to come to Lyon and present their work, their ideas, and the discussions, and even meet with the politicians. So this is the mayor of the city, who later became the interior minister for some years ago. Anyway, so that kind of real confrontation of real politics and real life also can be a part of the Biennale initiatives. And this is the continuation of this kind of effort in Auckland. And then this also in turn comes to influence how I operate into a Western institution that I'm now the artistic director, the MAXXI, the National Museum of Contemporary 21st Century Arts in Rome. And for the last few years, we have established this ongoing program called The Independent, in which we provide the different spaces in the museum for different independent organizations to present their work, to come to discuss with each other. And then this also has an online section in which we presented a continuous kind of mapping of this organizational network, and also an online magazine. And then this brings us to maybe the last part of my presentation about the idea of how this infrastructure has been conceived and also tested, and what we called it a creation of the reality through artistic research. So the idea is really to build a laboratory to use the opportunity of curating an exhibition, a Biennale or Triennale, to make it into a kind of ongoing laboratory. So this is the example of Guangzhou Triangle 2005 that I co-curated with Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Guo Xiaoyan, a Chinese curator. And so we decided to use the entire 3 years of the events, because it's called the Triennale. So basically it should be happening 3 years later. But we decided to started the project from the day one, namely 18 months before the opening of the exhibition. We created this Delta Lab to explore the question of the Pearl River Delta as a laboratory of modernization for China. And so every month, every few weeks, we invite artists, architects, intellectuals, and students and professors and so on to gather in this laboratory to exchange their ideas, to also come to research on the local context and come up with with artistic projects and architectural projects. And at the end, so this project actually has been going on for 3 years. And at the end, after the opening, we, from a few months before the opening, we invited Ram Koolhaas to come to do research. And then over the discussion, we found out there's an opportunity to build a new museum in the city, a new extension of the museum. So we invited him to think about museum in a kind of urban development project, a kind of real estate place. So, you know, in China, also in many other places, the main sponsors of this kind of events are often developers, housing, real estate, and so on. So in the suburb of Guangzhou, there's a large development of a housing project in which the buildings are already under construction. So we thought Ram Koolhaas can come to help us to think about a museum in the garden of this housing project. But he found out that this structure of the garden is surrounded by this high-rise housing. So that means it's kind of how to say, gated community almost. So people cannot have access easily into the garden from the street. So he said, no, this is not the thing that we should do. We should do a truly public museum. This public museum should be accessible from the street. And then we find out there's no more space in this construction site. Well, you have a place, you can have an empty space for this museum to be accessible from the street. So he proposed to actually create the museum sitting on the roof of this high-rise building, and then with a special elevator systems to connect this to a shop space, and then to have access to the museum, to the street. And that actually needs exceptional efforts to make it happen. If number one, it's very tricky in the sense that to mix a public use infrastructure with a private housing together, it's not allowed by the urban code normally. It's not legal. And the second thing is actually the relationship between different levels of the people living here and the museum, what's happening there would be generating a lot of conflicts and so on. So we managed to convince the city to give us an authorization to do an experimental project, and then this museum has been built as a very interesting, highly experimental way to think about infrastructure to come directly into the everyday life of people. And the content of the program of this museum, it's also very, much related to this initiative of the idea of bringing the public life into the private into the public. So this museum, by definition, physically, it's impossible to show very large sculptures. For example, there's no way to bring these works up there. So everything in this space is a lot about much more flexible, immaterial kind of interventions. And it's open space for much more intellectual discussions and presentation and so on, rather than the so-called market-driven large installations. And then also a major effort for this museum, it's called the Times Museum. It's to create an interaction with the local community. So they regularly organize not only, education workshop for kids and so on, but a local cultural festival. Every year, the local cultural festival. And then what is interesting is...
So who may I ask?
Yeah.
I know that this is very interesting work and projects, but I need to also present Margarita, and then we can have a discussion. So perhaps we can revisit this in the discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we are not able to connect with Margarita, but she sent a text that I will briefly summarize here. She says, my work deals with the importance of the creation of the Havana Biennial in Cuba in 1984 and the role it has played in the promotion and visibility of Cuban and international art. She says that in the creation in 1983, the Wilfredo Lam Contemporary Art Center considers among its main objectives the study of contemporary art from the Third World and the organization of the Havana Biennials. And its purpose is to investigate and disseminate the visual arts of Latin America, Caribbean, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The emergence of the Wilfredo Lam Center in the first half of the 80s came to signify a new starting point of international projection of these regions that had been displaced from participation in the main global scenarios. And the objective of the Havana Biennial has been continuously to support this project for almost 40 years now. The biennial was inserted in kind of, in the global stage by an awareness of the sharpening of the center periphery contradictions and also the marked subaltern character of the cultures and visual productions of the whole South. And that's why it focused on the projection of the work from this area, what we may call the global South. And the researchers and theorists had agreed to form a new methodology. So there was this very innovative thinking happening in the 80s to implement other tools that would allow us to evaluate the artistic practices from our own context. 13 editions have taken place between 1984 and 2019. And the Havana Biennial has had very beneficial effects on Cuban art and its development through all these years, especially on Latin America and other regions and its promotion. The first Havana Biennial was held in 1984 and was focusing on Latin America and the Caribbeans, whose again artists and production which had not really been seen in the so-called first world countries. And it was not intended to focus on individual projects, but to achieve a vast and plural representation of the countries in the region as a kind of a panorama or a kind of a meter that would allow us to update ourselves in the artistic, global artistic platforms. For this occasion, an object of reflection had not been established. This took place, however, in the third edition, which has continued to the present day. So in other words, there's also a reflective academic component that started with the third biennial. One of the points of interrogation is the claim of our plural Latin American and Caribbean identity, and to analyze the constituent parts of this syncretic kind of identity and product, which remains a kind of a challenge for all of us. The second biennial was held in 1986, already had a third world character and extended its scope to the countries of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Both biennials are crucial to study the subsequent editions. They are both kind of foundational in this respect. So the Havana Biennial emerges as an alternative with respect to homologous international kind of developments to accommodate these neglected regions and to favor their promotion on a global scale and to enable dialogue and better communication between the guests and the visitors of different countries. What motivated the creation of the biennial was the interest in demolishing the physical and subjective borders that for many years had expanded the isolation between our countries. However, it is valid to mention that Cuban art had already found very favorable conditions for its development, and that is why we had become an important benchmark for the rest of the countries in the area. And the integration of the artistic expressions from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, starting in the subsequent biennials after the first, made possible the emergence of common languages and points of view, and made it possible to verify the thematic and stylistic diversities that coexist in the same context. So the third biennial, of course, is also a very significant one in 1989. In fact, there is a study of it published by After All Books, and which gives a good context also for the first two biennials. So I'm very sorry that Margarita has not been able to present herself, but this is just a summary of the thoughts that she had communicated to us. So with that, I would like to invite our audiences to send in their questions, and also for our panelists. We do have a question already, if I may begin with that. So the question is from Salah Hassan, and I quote, "I wonder what it means to say farewell to post-colonialism. Is it a fantasy or provocation, or an attempt at different theorization of our current world condition? Is a similar iteration of the decolonial as another attempt at an accurate description of the post-colonial era, in which the colonized subject is depicted as more proactive, or as Latin American thinkers proposed, as coloniality of power in the work of somebody like Anibal Quijano?" So I think this is a question for all of us, but who maybe this is something maybe you want to begin with.
Yeah, I actually brought this in a kind of, also the same question as Salah, actually, with certain degree of irony, because at the time, it's not my project, it was the project that actually following the Triennale I curated in 2005. It was curated by my Chinese colleague Gao Shiming, and also with the involvement of Sarah Maharaj and also Johnson Chong, I think, and a few other people, right? So they came up with this title. Actually, it's called Farewell to Postcolonialism. And I think there's some interesting thing about this. At first, I actually answered to a question of a journalist who had the same question to me, but at the time, I said, I actually look at the title, I didn't understand it. That became a title of a newspaper, an article in the newspaper, actually. It was crazy. But and after that, I really thought that was an interesting provocation, in the sense that I think that the intention was to say, okay, China should not be counted as a part of a normal post-colonial context. And there's a kind of, indirectly, there might be a certain kind of desire to establish a singularity of so-called Chineseness, right? And that, I don't know, you should ask my colleague, Gao Shiming. But in the meantime, there was also the first time that post-colonial theories have been somehow more systematically introduced into our context in China. So that was, this is why they invited Sarah Maharaj, for example, and a few other people, to actually to have discussions on this question. So, I think it's a more kind of provocation and a strategy, a combination of both, to make its own mark in the history of biennials. I think it was really interesting, and my understanding is, the irony is, that was the beginning of the post-colonial in China.
So you interpret this as an ironic and tongue-in-cheek kind of title, or a provocation, huh?
Probably, yeah. You should ask those guys.
Okay. There is another comment on this topic by Pamela Kember.
Oh yeah, hey Pamela.
Yes, go ahead, Thembi.
Can I say something on that? Thanks for bringing that question, Unru. I was part of that exhibition, by the way, the Triennale in 2008.
Yeah.
And I went to
Guangzhou.
to Guangzhou in China. Yeah. So I was an artist there, like not a curator, I think. I think one of the things that came out during the conversation, both with the curators and the artists, in particular from Sarad's thinking, as Juan Reza just said, it was like more than a provocation. It was also to ask, can we think differently? Or can we rethink what are the strengths or what are the dead ends of post-colonial thinking, especially with the dynamics that were shifting, because now, especially when with the rise of Asia as a 21st century power. So are they going to reproduce some of the dogmas and the problematics that have been happening in so-called post-colonial countries in Africa, so to speak, or even in Latin America? So that was one of the issues. But also they were asking artists to think with them, because that's one of the things. If you read the catalog, especially with Sarad's essay, was to ask for new ways of thinking about what a post-colonial can be in the 21st century. You know, I mean, as a renewal of thinking, but also as a renewal form of criticism. Because one of the greatest gifts from post-colonialism is this constant critique of going back and forth. You know, I mean, because the beauty of post-colonial is that it encompasses a number of things. It reminds us of the importance of the anti-colonial struggle, anti-colonial politics. At the same time, it brings into perspective the question of the decolonial, right? So that's what they were asking, and to ask what art can do to make us think differently, to think as creatively and innovatively about the dead ends of what has become a tradition of the post-colonial. I just wanted to contribute just briefly on that. You can go on.
Yeah, so that's, I think, a good way to conceive it as a re-examination of the question and the kind of and the productivity of the term and what it might enable for us going forward. This is also a comment by Pamela Kember, who says, "Who Hanru regarding farewell to post-colonialism, the extended title towards a post-Western modernity raises another point. Are we seeing a genuine intervention into post-Western non-Eurocentric discourse or modernity taking place within international biennials?" And I think this has been answered partly by your presentation, Hu, and also your answer to the previous question. Samantha Wright raises another point. How can artists be more involved in the curating and programming of a biennial to benefit the community? This is exactly the point that Thembe raised, at the beginning of our session. And certainly, this is, what it. I mean, looking at the scenario now, we have so many biennials in the world now, right? So there is no, and also that they are working at various scales. So I think there is no one model for the biennial anymore, right? I mean, there are certain very minimal things that they share, that it happens every 2 years and it's a temporary exhibition and it's not a national exhibition, but it's supposed to be international, etc. But beyond that, there really aren't rules, right? There aren't really rules as to what a biennial looks like. So I think there's enormous scope for creative, interpretation and thinking about the biennial format as it suits a local circumstance. I mean, I'm struck by also the, Thembe's, kind of observations about the South African and even the Dakar and, other African contexts. And some of the images you showed, in which you have, a place like Guangzhou or developments in China. I mean, these are no longer, South Korea is no longer its per capita income and so on is as high as, as Western Europe, right? Or even higher perhaps. So I think the The question of unevenness, I think when we even talk about the global south, I think we really have to be cognizant of the kind of unevenness in development, right? So you see, and that of course is going to, the question of scale, the question of capitalization, the question of resources is going to vary widely, I think, right? And I think for every location, people have to kind of ask the question as to what they are doing within their own context to make, to encourage the values that actually Thembe asked us to reflect upon plurality, inclusion, awareness of the world, and promoting equality and justice, in whatever way that art is able to. And so I think the question of what to do is an open one, and also an enormously productive one, I would say, right? Another question I have, which is by Salah Hassan, the question to Thembe. I wonder if you can reflect on what you called infrastructure and communalist biennial. So I would not use the word communalist, because communal in the South Asia context has this, I would say communist, right? Communalist has a sectarian character in South Asian terminology. Okay, but anyway, yeah. Thembe, would you like to?
Thanks, Iftikhar, and thanks, Salah. As I said earlier, I dropped those concepts deliberately as provocation, as I said in my presentation. What is left, or what is propelling from the Marxist project in an era where neoliberal capitalism is really driving the world into a certain direction. So is it possible to hack back and appropriate some of what has been discredited, which to some extent for me, it is a very, in particular in post-colonial context, because most of the post-colonial countries, especially the anti-colonial struggle, they were built, or they found currency and agency from the Marxist project of different variants, to the extent that now by the 90s, especially with South Africa as one of the last independent countries from this fight against this most we call colonialism, and the settlement that South Africa went through in terms of entering a democracy, not to win, not to collapse apartheid as a regime, but to negotiate it. And it is this goals that we are wrestling with. And the neoliberal capitalist project is winning for some of us who are living in this part of the world, because all of the principles, the promises and the expectation that were built or were part of the liberation struggles are just falling apart, or they've been suspended, if not they've been relegated into a zone of obscurity, right? You find politicians spinning around because the Marxist project is not only abandoned, but also is turned against too. I'm saying this also thinking, for example, of the gift that Frantz Fanon gave us in thinking what Marx can do, but to stretch it, that project, the Marxist project, when it comes to the colonial context, right? Whether you're bringing race issue, and even when the feminists, Black feminists, African feminists, they bring this different dimension to complicate that project, which is a sustained critique of capitalism. So to answer Salah's question, I don't have an answer, but I do think, for me, the idea of socialist communist project to try and avoid what Iftikhar is helping to think about, is just to do how to work with, from the community. We are talking here about specific communities. Communities that are not abstracted, because the tendency with theory or discourse is to abstract communities. Is to ask, for example, when we are staging these biennales, whether it's in Dakar, it's in Kampala, anywhere, what it means to ask what are the needs of those communities. And the need of the communities should not be burden of the artist, but artists should be also asked to think with those communities, to design projects.
I think the question for me would be, so there's a number of questions that have to do with infrastructure and how the biennial can develop infrastructure. But I think the question of community involvement is also a vexed one, because, we've had social practice for a long time, okay? And I think social practice has been both celebrated and critiqued, right? In terms of precisely its attempt to engage with community, but also, the critique, among the critiques is that artists don't really spend, they do a project and leave, etc., right? And so it's not really a sustained engagement with the community, right? So it's not like things have not, I think we need to, I would want the discussion to take into account, the presence of social practice as a modality in the last 20, 30 years, and then, what we have learned and what it does and what it fails to do, I think, would be, yeah.
Yes, Iftikhar, but my point is that how do you revise and reimagine these practices, the social practices, in ways that are productive for the communities in which these biennales are taking part? I'm interested in the production of the locality. A locality that is not distanced or is not in isolation from the global development, instead of this touch and go. Because part of the problem with the biennales and this so-called mega festival is touch and go. That's why I'm saying, how do you work to build infrastructures? Infrastructure, I'm not talking about only physical buildings. I'm talking about human resources, intelligence, skills, knowledge, so that those communities sustain themselves on the basis of what communities need as a way of living and going on in an event whereby politicians and the governance in the post-colonial world don't care, because they're part of what, I think Hanru has brought it, this so-called propelling neo-colonialist project driven by capitalist interest of the first world. So what I'm saying is, whether we instrumentalize art or not, but art has to intervene in that project. It cannot only be like, you put project, you intervene, you have a party, we leave. No, it must leave a sustained, tangible, as well as idealist, fantastic project that keep those communities alive and looking for a future that they can hold on. So for me, that's not an ideal. That's a reality I'm talking about. So what I'm saying is, yes, these social justice projects have been there, but they tend to be mainly articulated in theory. So what I'm asking, hence I was saying, maybe this is a burden of curators, it's not an artist, because artists don't invite themselves into biennales. Biennales have been assigned, the authority of biennales rests mainly with art, the curators. So how and in what way curators can begin to think, I don't like the word from the bottom up, but to work with the ground, not for the ground, to work with the ground. Because the problem to work with is always to design things and impose and leave. But to work with the ground is to force to be humble. So that's what I'm thinking. So in other words, my interest is to ask what art can become in extension to what it has been doing. Art has been doing a lot, but I'm asking more at the level of actual development, social, cultural, economic, human, and so forth. That's what I'm asking, what the Biennale can do, whether we call it by whatever name. And part of the problem with why the South African Biennale stopped after Oki's project, that's not Oki's project. Oki did a great job to open it up, to make South Africa open to the world and build the possibilities for artists that would benefited. But the problem was not that there was never effective build of infrastructure. That's why even the municipality and politicians, they capitalize on the fact that what it is that we are spending our money on in Johannesburg. And with that, they were able to use that as an excuse. So what I'm asking, as a build up on this kind of what we call it shortfalls, that's not Oki's problem. Oki did what he did, and he did greatly. So what we are asking now in learning from that, what can the Biennale become in this context whereby politicians are not only, uninformed about the cultural capital, the importance of arts. What the Biennale, we cannot wait for politicians. We have to find active way of saying a Biennale must be a form of building infrastructure. As I said, I'm not talking about tangible or materialistic only. I'm talking about even from the intellectual, from just even from the structural feeling, what it means to have an institution or infrastructure, that when the Biennale ends its duration, but that duration doesn't stop with the end of event.
Yeah.
So that's the locals.
Thembi, I think we all are with you on this. You know, the question is whether, I mean, from a skeptic, let me wear the skeptical hat for a minute, okay? And I would say the Biennale cannot do what you're asking it to do because it cannot substitute for state-led human development, okay? Which is actually has failed a lot in. So unless you have mass education, good universities, etc., a temporary event cannot substitute for the enduring, commitment to development that actually states and cities ought to have to their populace and citizens. Okay, so having said that, of course, I think curators do and have done what they have, tried to do. I think Hanru showed us many examples, right, of the project in France, the one with the, the one with the working with the migrants, for example, or
in Lyon, yeah.
In Lyon, yeah, and even the Times Museum, which developed infrastructure. Of course, not everyone can afford to hire, Rem Koolhaas.
No, actually, his fee was very, very low. I have to tell you, this is a private project. It's not his company, so he accepted with pleasure to really work almost for free by the standard of a famous architect. It's like really a private laboratory almost to test out possibilities, which is the irony is really interesting. Is in this context, the capital of this developer were used for a absolutely experimental thing. Just not, and there's no accountability in terms of we have this small budget and let's do something, and that was so that was actually using this biennial actually can transform also some some mental situations of some actors. For example, a big architect like this, a big artist, when he joined the project like this, maybe he would temporarily turn himself into a experimental newcomer to try new things, right? So that's also something really curatorially you can also manage to somehow create an interesting chemical situations, interactions among the participants that maybe make them kind of distant from their normal life. So to share kind of idealist moment.
Great. Now that's good to know. I think from the slides it seemed very like a slick project, but I think
it's a very, very low budget project.
Yeah, so I think that can provide examples for other, kind of contexts as well. I'm aware of time. We have to end soon. I wanted to end on a more hopeful note, perhaps, okay, which is to say that, I'm based in the US, and in my free time that I have, I sometimes read news about the economy, globally. And I think what's happening is, there's a kind of an emerging consensus, at least in the US, among many even mainstream economists, that the age of neoliberalism may be, there's transformations taking place. So in other words, partly even what you saw in the US with kind of, state-led, again, intervention and financing of the economy may actually filter across the rest of the world. So even the kind of agendas that were followed by IMF and so on for the last 30, 40 years may actually be changing, right? And there may be a renewed commitment to state and kind of city and region-led kind of development of human and infrastructural resources and capital. I hope this is a turning point. I think post-COVID, it may be a turning point. And also I think post-COVID, it may, biennials may want to reflect as to what they can do to build, to provide local employment in terms of, or to build infrastructure, both human and kind of physical, that Thembi is kind of enjoined us to think about. So with that, I would like to thank our speakers. and our audiences, and for your questions and your engagement with this panel. And please continue to also to participate and to in the remaining March meetings. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.